There was once a civilization that built enormous cities, carefully planned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, and houses that were far more advanced than we might expect from the ancient world. Its people traded across great distances. They created pottery, jewelry, tools, and seals. They lived in organized communities. And then something changed. The cities became silent. The streets that had once been filled with people were abandoned. Homes were left behind. Markets disappeared. And one of the greatest urban civilizations of the ancient world slowly faded from history. This was the civilization of the Indus Valley. But the biggest mystery is not how they built their cities. The real mystery is, why did they leave them? Thousands of years ago, in the lands that today include parts of Pakistan and northwestern India, a remarkable civilization began to grow. It developed around some of the great rivers of South Asia. The landscape was very different from what we see today. Rivers flowed through vast plains. Seasonal rains transformed the land. Forests, grasslands, and fertile agricultural regions supported growing communities. At first, these communities were relatively small, but over generations, something extraordinary happened. Villages began to expand. People learned to cultivate crops more efficiently. They domesticated animals. They developed specialized crafts, and slowly, small settlements became larger and more organized. Eventually, enormous cities appeared. Among the most famous were Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. When archaeologists began uncovering these places, they discovered something astonishing. The streets were carefully planned. Many buildings were constructed with standardized bricks. Some houses had bathing areas. There were sophisticated drainage systems. Wastewater could be carried away through covered drains running along the streets. For an ancient civilization, this was remarkable. But perhaps the most fascinating thing was the organization behind it. Someone had to plan these cities. Someone had to produce millions of standardized bricks. Someone had to organize construction. Someone had to maintain roads, buildings, water systems, and trade. Yet the civilization left behind very little obvious evidence of powerful kings or giant royal monuments. There are no enormous pyramids dominating its cities. There are no huge statues celebrating famous rulers. Instead, we find something different. A civilization built around urban organization, trade, craftsmanship, and everyday life. And then there are the mysterious seals. Small objects carved with animals and symbols. Some show bulls. Some show elephants. Some show strange mythical creatures, and alongside these animals are symbols that appear to represent a writing system. But there is a problem. We still cannot confidently read it. Imagine finding thousands of written messages from an ancient civilization, but being unable to understand what they say. That is exactly the situation we face with the Indus script. Perhaps those symbols recorded names. Perhaps they represented religious ideas. Perhaps they documented trade. Maybe they contained stories. We simply do not know. And that silence makes the disappearance of this civilization even more mysterious. For centuries, these cities flourished. People farmed the surrounding lands. Merchants traveled long distances. Goods moved between settlements. Craftsmen produced pottery, ornaments, metal objects, and beads. The civilization was connected to distant regions. Archaeological evidence suggests trade networks extended far beyond the cities themselves. Life was not primitive. It was organized, complex, urban, and remarkably sophisticated. But civilizations do not remain unchanged forever. Something began to happen. Some cities started to decline. Population patterns changed. Large urban centers became less important. People gradually moved towards smaller settlements. Trade networks weakened. And eventually, many of the great cities were abandoned. But why? For a long time, historians proposed dramatic explanations. Perhaps invading armies destroyed the cities. Perhaps a massive war swept through the region. Maybe disease killed large numbers of people or a catastrophic earthquake destroyed their homes. But archaeology has complicated these theories. There is no simple piece of evidence saying, this is what destroyed the Indus civilization. Instead, the evidence points toward a much more complicated story. One possibility involves climate. The environment around these cities was deeply connected to rivers and seasonal rainfall. If rainfall patterns changed, agriculture could become more difficult. Rivers could change their courses. Water sources could become less reliable. And when agriculture becomes unstable, an entire urban system can begin to weaken. Imagine living in a city of tens of thousands of people. Every day, those people need food. Farmers must grow enough crops. Traders must move goods. Water must remain available. Craftsmen need raw materials. The entire system depends on thousands of invisible connections. Break enough of those connections, and the city begins to struggle. Perhaps this is what happened. Not one enormous disaster, not one dramatic invasion, but a slow transformation. The climate changed. Rivers shifted. Agricultural conditions became more difficult. Trade routes changed, and people gradually adapted. They moved. They abandoned large cities. They established smaller communities elsewhere. And over generations, the urban civilization that had once dominated the region became something very different. But there is another mystery. If the people disappeared from the cities, where did they go? This is one of the most important questions, because the civilization did not simply vanish from the human story. Its people did not disappear from Earth. What disappeared was the urban system, the giant cities, the centralized organization, the networks that connected distant settlements. The civilization transformed. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. When we say an ancient civilization disappeared, it can create the wrong image. We imagine millions of people suddenly vanishing, but history is often much slower. People move, languages change, cultures mix, cities decline, new communities emerge, and eventually the original civilization becomes difficult to recognize. The streets remain, the bricks remain, the pottery remains, the seals remain, but the people who created them are gone, and that is where the mystery becomes almost haunting. Walk through the remains of an ancient city today. Look at the houses. Look at the narrow streets. Look at the drains running beneath them. Imagine children once running through those streets. Imagine merchants opening their shops. Imagine craftsmen working with metal, stone, and clay. Imagine families preparing food inside their homes, or people meeting friends in the same places where archaeologists now walk in silence. These were not ruins when they were built. They were homes. They were neighborhoods. They were communities. They were someone's entire world. And then slowly that world changed. The Indus Valley civilization reminds us that even the most organized societies are vulnerable to change. Cities can rise, cities can prosper, and cities can fall. But perhaps the greatest mystery is not why the cities were abandoned. Perhaps it is what the people thought while they were leaving. Did they know their old way of life was ending? Did they believe they would return one day? Did they understand that future generations would walk through their homes and wonder what happened? We may never know, because the civilization left us clues but not answers. Its symbols remain undeciphered. Its cities remain silent. Its story is scattered across thousands of archaeological discoveries, and somewhere among those ancient bricks may be the answer to one of history's greatest mysteries. A civilization once stood here. It built cities that amazed the modern world. It created complex systems long before many famous ancient empires appeared. And then, it changed. not necessarily with one final battle, not necessarily with one catastrophic night, but through a long transformation that turned great cities into abandoned ruins. Today, thousands of years later, we can still see what they left behind. The streets, the houses, the wells, the drains, the seals, the pottery, the mysterious symbols. Everything seems to whisper the same question: who were these people, and what really happened to their world? Certainly one day, archaeologists will discover the missing evidence. Perhaps the ancient script will finally be understood. Perhaps a new excavation will reveal exactly how these cities changed. Until then, the civilization remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are not the ones that tell us how a civilization was destroyed. They are the stories that leave us wondering how an entire world could slowly disappear without leaving behind a clear explanation.